The massive hooves thundered against the wooden platform with the force of 1,000 stampedes as Ayanna pressed herself flat against the cold morning earth, watching in absolute terror and awe as the impossible creature towered above Copper Creek Station. This was no ordinary buffalo. Standing nearly 12 feet tall at the shoulder, its midnight black hide rippled with an otherworldly luminescence that seemed to pulse with each devastating blow it delivered to the train station below. Steam rose from its nostrils in great billowing clouds that mixed with the dust and debris flying through the dawn air as passengers scattered like tumbleweeds in every direction, their screams piercing the Arizona morning. Ayanna had been gathering sage root near the old Apache burial grounds when the earth first began to tremble beneath her feet. At 19 years old, she possessed her grandmother's gift for sensing disturbances in the spiritual realm, but nothing had prepared her for this manifestation of raw ancestral power. The creature's eyes burned with an ancient intelligence that spoke of centuries-old grievances and promises that had been broken too many times to count. As she watched from her hiding spot among the red rocks, she understood with crystal clarity that this was no random act of nature's fury. The giant buffalo raised itself up on its hind legs and brought its full weight crashing down onto the station's main support beam. The sound of splintering wood and twisted metal echoed across the desert like thunder, sending vibrations through the ground that Ayanna could feel in her bones. Through the chaos and flying debris, she caught glimpses of the train station's foundation being exposed for the first time since its construction 3 years earlier. What she saw there made her blood run cold and her heart pound with a mixture of recognition and horrific understanding. Clayton Morrison, the portly railroad superintendent with his perfectly waxed mustache and expensive Eastern suits, came stumbling out of the station office clutching a leather satchel to his chest. His usual composure had completely abandoned him as he stared up at the massive creature that continued its methodical destruction of everything he had built on this plot of Arizona Territory land. Morrison's face had gone pale as desert sand, and sweat poured down his temples despite the cool morning air. Ayanna noticed how his hands trembled as he backed away from the station, his eyes darting nervously between the giant buffalo and the newly exposed ground where the station's foundation had been. The creature seemed to sense Morrison's presence and turned its massive head toward the fleeing superintendent. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the ancient buffalo and the modern railroad man locked eyes across the destroyed platform. In that gaze, Ayanna sensed a communication that transcended spoken language, a recognition of guilt and consequence that made Morrison stumble backward and fall hard onto his backside in the dirt. The buffalo's eyes glowed brighter for an instant, as if marking the man for future reckoning, before returning its attention to the systematic demolition of every structure connected to the train station. As the last of the terrified passengers and railroad workers disappeared into the desert scrub, seeking shelter behind rocks and in abandoned mine shafts, Ayanna found herself alone with the supernatural scene unfolding below. The giant buffalo completed its destruction with what seemed like deliberate precision, ensuring that every board, every nail, and every stone of the station was reduced to scattered ruins. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature let out a final, earth-shaking bellow that echoed off the canyon walls and began its retreat back toward the sacred mountains from which it had emerged. The silence that followed felt heavier than the destruction itself. Ayanna waited long minutes before slowly rising from her hiding place and making her way down the rocky slope toward the ruins. Her moccasins made no sound as she picked her way carefully through the wreckage, following an instinct she couldn't quite name but trusted completely. The morning sun was now fully above the horizon, casting long shadows across the demolished platform and illuminating something that made her stop dead in her tracks. There, in the exposed earth where the station's foundation had been torn away, lay a collection of objects that told a story more terrible than any nightmare. Human bones, yellowed with age and arranged with the care that spoke of proper Apache burial rituals, were scattered among the broken concrete and twisted rail spikes. But these weren't just any bones. Ayanna recognized the distinctive turquoise and silver bracelet still circling the wrist bone of one skeleton, the same bracelet her mother had worn every day until she mysteriously disappeared 5 years ago during a routine trading trip to town. Her hands shook as she knelt beside the remains, carefully brushing away dirt and debris with a reverence born of cultural tradition and personal grief. The more she uncovered, the more horrific the truth became. These weren't the remains of one person, but rather an entire family group. Men, women, and children had been buried here hastily and without ceremony, their bodies showing clear signs of violence. Bullet holes in skulls, broken bones that spoke of desperate struggles, and personal items that Ayanna recognized as belonging to members of her extended tribe who had vanished over the past several years. The sound of approaching horses made her look up sharply. Morrison was returning with a group of armed men, their faces grim and their weapons ready. She could see them scanning the area, looking for any signs of survivors or witnesses to what had just occurred. Ayanna knew instinctively that her life was in immediate danger if they discovered her among the ruins. She quickly gathered several pieces of evidence, including her mother's bracelet and a distinctive Apache medicine pouch that had belonged to her great-uncle, before slipping away into the maze of rock formations that surrounded the destroyed station. From her new vantage point high above the ruins, she watched as Morrison directed his men in a frantic effort to rebury the exposed remains before anyone else could discover them. The superintendent's earlier terror had transformed into cold determination as he supervised the hasty covering of evidence that could destroy not only his railroad career but potentially his life if the territorial authorities ever learned what had really happened to the missing Apache families. Ayanna realized she was witnessing the continuation of a cover-up that had been going on for years, a systematic elimination of her people that had been disguised as random disappearances and unexplained absences. As the workers labored to hide their crimes, Ayanna noticed Morrison repeatedly checking a gold pocket watch and glancing nervously toward the mountain peaks where the giant buffalo had vanished. His behavior suggested that he understood, perhaps better than anyone, that this supernatural intervention was far from over. The buffalo had not come to destroy property for the sake of destruction but rather to expose truth that had been buried along with innocent lives. The creature's mission was clear, and Morrison's guilty conscience told him that this was only the beginning of a reckoning that would shake the very foundations of everything he had built in Arizona territory. The sun climbed higher as Ayanna watched the men work, her mind racing with plans for what she must do next. The evidence in her possession proved that her mother and other tribal members had been murdered by Morrison and his associates, but bringing this truth to light would require careful strategy and considerable courage. The white man's justice system rarely sided with Apache accusations, especially against wealthy and influential railroad officials who brought prosperity to frontier towns. She would need to find allies, gather more evidence, and most importantly, understand the full extent of the spiritual forces that had awakened to help her people find justice. The giant buffalo's appearance was no coincidence. According to the oldest stories her grandmother had shared, such manifestations occurred only when the balance between the living and the dead had been so severely disrupted that the spirit world itself intervened to restore order. The creature had chosen to reveal the truth at this precise moment, which meant that the time for hiding and passive endurance had finally ended. Ayanna felt the weight of ancestral expectations settling on her shoulders as she realized that she had become the instrument through which justice would either be served or forever denied. As Morrison's men completed their hasty reburial and began dispersing back toward town, Ayanna made her way carefully through the desert terrain toward the Apache settlement where her father served as tribal medicine man. She carried with her not only physical evidence of the crimes that had been committed but also a growing understanding of her role in events that would determine the future of her people in this rapidly changing land. The giant buffalo had demolished more than just a train station. It had torn away the veil of deception that had hidden systematic murder and opened a path toward truth that could no longer be ignored or buried beneath the supposed progress of American expansion into Apache territory. The ancient cottonwood trees that marked the entrance to the Apache settlement whispered secrets in the afternoon wind as Ayanna approached her father's dwelling with trembling hands still clutching the damning evidence she had recovered from the destroyed train station. The familiar scent of burning sage and cedar should have comforted her, but instead it seemed to carry an undercurrent of mourning that matched the terrible knowledge now weighing on her heart. She could see Nailnish sitting cross-legged outside his lodge, his weathered hands working methodically to prepare traditional medicines, but his usually serene expression was clouded with the same spiritual unrest that had been building for months across their sacred lands. Nailnish looked up as his daughter approached, and the moment his eyes met hers, she knew that he had felt the supernatural disturbance that had shaken the earth that morning. His face bore the marks of a man who had been expecting this day for far too long, someone who had carried terrible suspicions in his heart but had hoped against hope that they would prove unfounded. When Ayanna silently opened her palm to reveal her mother's distinctive turquoise bracelet, still stained with the red earth of an unmarked grave, the old medicine man's composure finally cracked and tears began flowing down his deeply lined cheeks. The bracelet lay between them like an accusation, its beautiful silver work tarnished by years of burial but still unmistakably the piece that Ayana's mother, Itzel, had treasured above all her possessions. Nailnish reached out with shaking fingers to touch the jewelry that had adorned his beloved wife's wrist on the last day he had seen her alive. That had been 5 years ago, when Itzel had insisted on traveling to Copper Creek to trade her pottery and beadwork for supplies the family needed for the coming winter. She had never returned, and Morrison's men had claimed to have no knowledge of her whereabouts despite numerous searches and inquiries from tribal members. Ayana carefully placed the medicine pouch and bone fragments she had recovered beside the bracelet, creating a small shrine to the dead on the woven mat where her father conducted his spiritual work. As she arranged each piece of evidence with the reverence due to sacred remains, she began to speak in their native tongue, describing everything she had witnessed at the train station ruins. She told him about the giant buffalo's methodical destruction, Morrison's panicked attempts to conceal the exposed burial site, and most importantly, the clear signs that multiple Apache families had been murdered and secretly buried beneath the railroad's foundation. Nailnish listened to his daughter's account with growing horror and rage, but also with a terrible recognition that confirmed his darkest fears about the disappearances that had plagued their people for years. He had always suspected that Morrison and his associates were involved in more than just railroad construction, particularly after several tribal members had reported seeing Apache prisoners being transported in unmarked wagons toward the train station area. The medicine man had brought these concerns to the territorial authorities multiple times, but his reports had been dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of a primitive people who didn't understand the requirements of modern progress. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert sky in shades of crimson and gold that reminded Ayana painfully of her mother's favorite colors, more members of their extended family began gathering around Nailnish's lodge. Word of the morning's supernatural events had spread quickly through the settlement, and everyone understood that something of profound significance was unfolding. The elders spoke in hushed tones about ancient prophecies that described times when the spirits of the ancestors would rise up to demand justice for crimes committed against the living, while the younger warriors fingered their weapons and spoke angrily of immediate retaliation against Morrison and his men. Old Grandmother Ciala, the tribe's most respected keeper of oral traditions, stepped forward from the gathering crowd and examined the recovered evidence with eyes that had witnessed nearly 8 decades of change in Apache territory. Her gnarled hands trembled as she identified personal items belonging to her own grandson, who had vanished 2 years earlier while hunting near the railroad tracks. Other family members began recognizing belongings from their own missing relatives, creating a growing pile of proof that Morrison's crimes extended far beyond a single murder to encompass a systematic campaign of violence against anyone who might threaten his hidden operations in the area. The truth that emerged from these identifications was more horrific than anyone had imagined. Morrison hadn't simply been eliminating troublesome individuals who asked too many questions about railroad activities. Instead, he had been targeting entire family groups who possessed knowledge of valuable mineral deposits on Apache land, murdering them to prevent interference with his illegal mining operations that ran parallel to the official railroad construction. The train station had been built deliberately over the mass grave to ensure that the evidence would remain permanently hidden beneath tons of concrete and steel, while Morrison's legitimate railroad work provided perfect cover for his lucrative silver and copper extraction business. Ayana felt sick as she realized that her mother's murder had been motivated by Itzel's discovery of Morrison's secret mining activities during her trading visits to Copper Creek. Her mother had always been unusually observant and had probably noticed the discrepancies between Morrison's public claims about railroad construction and the actual work being performed at various sites around the territory. Morrison had likely decided that Itzel posed too great a risk to his operation and had eliminated her along with other family members who might have shared her knowledge or sought to investigate her disappearance. As darkness fell over the settlement, Nailnish called for a formal council meeting to determine how their people should respond to these revelations. The evidence was overwhelming, but the challenge lay in finding a way to bring Morrison to justice through legal channels that were controlled by the very system that benefited from his crimes. The territorial government had invested heavily in Morrison's railroad project and would be reluctant to prosecute someone whose work brought significant economic development to the region. Moreover, Morrison had accumulated considerable wealth and political influence that he would undoubtedly use to deflect any accusations brought against him by Apache witnesses. The council discussions continued deep into the night, with various tribal members proposing different approaches to the crisis. Some advocated for immediate violent retaliation against Morrison and his associates, arguing that their people had been systematically murdered and that traditional Apache justice demanded blood for blood. Others counseled patience and careful planning, suggesting that they should gather additional evidence and seek allies among the few white settlers who had shown respect for Apache rights and territorial claims. A third faction proposed spiritual warfare, calling on the medicine men to invoke supernatural forces like the giant buffalo to continue exposing Morrison's crimes until the truth could no longer be denied or covered up. Ayanna found herself caught between these competing philosophies, understanding the appeal of each approach while recognizing the dangers inherent in all of them. Direct violence against Morrison would certainly result in massive military retaliation against their entire community, potentially leading to the destruction of their settlement and the forced relocation of survivors to distant reservations where they would lose all connection to their ancestral lands. Legal approaches seemed equally hopeless given the systematic bias of territorial courts against Apache testimony and the lack of white witnesses willing to contradict Morrison's version of events. The supernatural intervention represented by the giant buffalo offered perhaps the most intriguing possibility, but Ayanna wasn't certain whether such manifestations could be reliably summoned or controlled to achieve specific objectives. Her father had taught her that spiritual forces operated according to their own logic and timeline, responding to cosmic imbalances rather than human desires for immediate justice. The giant buffalo had appeared when the hidden truth was ready to be revealed, but that didn't necessarily mean that additional supernatural interventions would occur exactly when needed to support their cause against Morrison. As the council meeting gradually wound down in the early hours of the morning, Ayanna made a decision that surprised even herself. She announced her intention to return to Copper Creek and confront Morrison directly with the evidence she had recovered, demanding that he confess his crimes and make restitution to the families he had destroyed. This approach was extremely dangerous, as Morrison would almost certainly try to silence her permanently rather than admit to multiple murders that could result in his execution. However, Ayanna believed that the spiritual forces awakened by the giant buffalo's appearance had chosen her specifically to serve as an instrument of justice, and she felt compelled to fulfill that role regardless of personal risk. Nailnish initially opposed his daughter's plan, arguing that she would be walking into certain death by confronting a desperate man who had already demonstrated his willingness to commit mass murder to protect his secrets. But as the discussion continued, other tribal members began supporting Ayanna's proposal, recognizing that her unique position as both a witness to the supernatural events and a discoverer of the physical evidence gave her a moral authority that might penetrate even Morrison's hardened conscience. If she could force him to acknowledge his guilt publicly, perhaps in front of witnesses who could spread the word throughout the territory, it might create enough pressure to ensure that justice was served through official channels. The final council decision was to allow Ayanna to attempt her confrontation with Morrison, but only with extensive support and protection from hidden tribal warriors who would position themselves around Copper Creek to intervene if the situation became life-threatening. Additionally, runners would be sent to sympathetic newspaper reporters in larger towns, carrying copies of the evidence and detailed accounts of Morrison's crimes that could be published even if Ayanna didn't survive her confrontation with the railroad superintendent. This multi-pronged approach would ensure that the truth about the mass murders would eventually reach the public regardless of Morrison's attempts to suppress it. As dawn approached and the council members began dispersing to their homes, Ayanna spent her final hours in the settlement praying with her father and receiving blessings from the tribal elders who understood that she might be walking toward her death in service of justice for their people. The morning sun that rose over the Apache settlement painted the sky in the same brilliant colors that had accompanied the giant buffalo's appearance, and Ayanna took this as a sign that the supernatural forces that had initiated this chain of events were still watching over her mission. Armed with sacred amulets, practical weapons, and unshakable determination to expose the truth about her mother's murder, she set out on the journey that would determine whether justice could triumph over corruption in the harsh landscape of the American frontier. The rebuilt remnants of Copper Creek Station cast long shadows across the desert floor as Ayanna approached on foot, her heart pounding with a mixture of determination and terror that threatened to overwhelm her resolve. 3 days had passed since the giant buffalo's supernatural intervention, and Morrison's crews had worked around the clock to construct a temporary platform and telegraph office that could restore basic railroad operations to the area. The hastily erected structures looked fragile and temporary compared to the solid permanence of the original station, as if the very land itself was rejecting any attempt to rebuild over the disturbed graves that lay beneath. Hidden among the scattered boulders and desert scrub that surrounded the settlement, Ayanna could see the positioned silhouettes of tribal warriors who had followed her to provide protection during her confrontation with the railroad superintendent. Their presence gave her courage, but she knew that ultimately this mission would succeed or fail based on her ability to force Morrison into revealing the truth about his systematic murder of Apache families. The evidence she carried in her leather pouch felt heavier than its actual weight, each piece representing not just proof of crimes committed but also the spirits of the dead who demanded recognition and justice. Morrison emerged from the telegraph office just as the afternoon sun reached its peak, his usual immaculate appearance somewhat disheveled from the frantic reconstruction efforts of the past several days. His expensive suit was dusty and wrinkled, his perfectly waxed mustache showed signs of nervous twisting, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man who knew that supernatural forces had targeted him specifically for retribution. When he spotted Ayanna walking openly across the cleared area toward the rebuilt platform, his face went pale and his hand instinctively moved toward the pistol holstered at his hip. The two figures faced each other across 20 yards of dusty ground that had been soaked with innocent blood, the descendant of murder victims confronting the man responsible for their deaths in a moment that seemed to crystallize all the tensions between two cultures struggling for survival in an unforgiving landscape. Ayanna could feel the weight of ancestral spirits gathering around them, invisible presences that had been awakened by the giant buffalo's intervention and now demanded that the truth be spoken aloud regardless of consequences. Morrison seemed to sense these supernatural observers as well, his eyes darting nervously to empty spaces where nothing visible stood but where the air itself seemed to shimmer with otherworldly energy. Ayanna slowly reached into her pouch and withdrew her mother's turquoise bracelet, holding it high enough for Morrison to see clearly in the bright desert sunlight. The jewelry caught and reflected the light in brilliant flashes that seemed to pierce Morrison's composure like arrows, and she watched his face cycle through recognition, guilt, and desperate calculation as he realized that his carefully buried secrets had literally been unearthed by forces beyond his control or understanding. His hand tightened on his pistol grip, but something in Ayanna's steady gaze and fearless posture made him hesitate to draw the weapon. Morrison's voice cracked slightly as he attempted to maintain his facade of innocent authority, demanding to know what business an Apache girl had coming onto railroad property without permission and threatening to have her arrested for trespassing on federal territory. But Ayanna could see through his bluster to the terrified man beneath, someone who understood that his crimes had been discovered and that no amount of money or political influence could protect him from the supernatural justice that had already begun manifesting around Copper Creek. She responded in clear, unaccented English that surprised Morrison with its educated precision, telling him that she knew exactly what lay buried beneath his rebuilt station and that the spirits of the murdered would not rest until their killer confessed his crimes. The bracelet seemed to burn in Ayanna's hand as she described finding it among the scattered remains that the giant buffalo had exposed, along with personal belongings from other Apache families that Morrison had systematically eliminated over the past several years. She named each victim whose identity she had been able to confirm, speaking their Apache names with reverence and dignity while watching Morrison's facade crumble with each revelation. His nervous behavior and guilty expressions confirmed what she had suspected, that he recognized every name she mentioned and remembered the circumstances under which each person had been murdered. Morrison's attempt to deny knowledge of the missing Apache families became increasingly desperate and unconvincing as Ayanna continued presenting evidence of his crimes. She described the illegal mining operations that had motivated the murders, the systematic targeting of individuals who might have discovered or interfered with his unauthorized mineral extraction activities, and the careful planning that had gone into using the train station construction as cover for burying the evidence of his systematic killings. Her detailed knowledge of his operations clearly shocked Morrison, who had believed that all witnesses to his activities had been permanently silenced. The railroad superintendent's composure finally collapsed entirely when Ayanna produced the distinctive Apache medicine pouch that had belonged to her great-uncle, a respected tribal leader whose mysterious disappearance had never been explained to the satisfaction of his family members. Morrison staggered backward as if the small leather bag had struck him physically, his eyes wide with the recognition of someone confronting evidence of crimes he had convinced himself were safely hidden forever. His hand shook as he pointed at the medicine pouch, and for a moment Ayanna thought he might actually confess everything rather than continue living with the psychological torment of his guilt. Instead, Morrison's fear transformed into desperate rage as he realized that this young Apache woman possessed enough evidence to destroy not only his career but his life itself if her accusations reached the territorial authorities. He drew his pistol with the quick motion of someone accustomed to violence, but before he could aim the weapon at Ayanna, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble with the same supernatural vibrations that had preceded the giant buffalo's appearance 3 days earlier. Morrison's eyes went wide with terror as he looked toward the mountains, clearly expecting another manifestation of the otherworldly forces that had already demolished his carefully constructed cover-up. The trembling intensified until loose stones began rolling down the nearby hillsides, and both Morrison and Ayanna could hear the distant sound of something massive moving through the desert terrain in their direction. Morrison's pistol wavered in his shaking hand as he tried to decide whether to shoot the witness to his crimes or flee before the giant buffalo returned to complete whatever supernatural mission had brought it to Copper Creek. Ayanna stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos, her connection to the spiritual realm allowing her to sense that the approaching presence was different from the buffalo that had exposed the burial site. What emerged from the desert heat shimmer was not the giant buffalo but rather a procession of translucent figures that seemed to be composed of dust and wind and the very essence of the Arizona landscape itself. Ayanna recognized them immediately as the spirits of the murdered Apache families, their forms becoming more solid and visible as they approached the site where their physical remains had been hidden beneath Morrison's railroad station. Her mother walked at the front of the ghostly procession, wearing the same clothes she had been buried in but moving with the dignity and purpose that had characterized her life among the living. Morrison screamed in terror as the spirits surrounded him, their presence causing his expensive clothes to flutter as if in a violent wind that touched no one else in the area. His pistol fell from nerveless fingers as phantom hands seemed to grasp at his arms and shoulders, pulling him toward the exact spot where the giant buffalo had exposed the mass grave that contained their earthly remains. Ayanna watched with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow as the man who had destroyed so many families finally faced the consequences of his actions in a form of justice that transcended any earthly court or legal system. The spirits began to speak in voices that carried on the desert wind, each one recounting the circumstances of their murder and the suffering their deaths had caused to the living family members left behind. Morrison fell to his knees as the ghostly testimony continued, his hands pressed to his ears in a futile attempt to block out accusations that seemed to come from the very air around him. Ayanna realized that this supernatural trial was serving the same function as the legal proceedings that her people could never have obtained through territorial courts, forcing Morrison to confront the full extent of his crimes and their impact on the Apache community. When the spirits finally fell silent, Morrison looked up at Ayanna with eyes that held the broken expression of a man whose sanity had been shattered by guilt and supernatural intervention. In a voice barely above a whisper, he began confessing everything, describing how the illegal mining operations had begun as a simple scheme to supplement his railroad salary but had gradually evolved into a systematic campaign of murder as more Apache families discovered his activities. He admitted to personally killing some victims while hiring others to eliminate witnesses whose disappearances might seem less connected to railroad operations. The confession continued for nearly an hour as Morrison described the location of additional burial sites, the names of accomplices who had helped him dispose of bodies and cover up evidence, and the complex web of bribery and intimidation he had used to prevent territorial authorities from investigating the disappearances too closely. Ayanna listened with growing horror as she realized that Morrison's crimes extended far beyond what she had discovered at the train station, encompassing dozens of murders across multiple counties and involving corrupt officials at every level of territorial government. As Morrison's confession concluded, the spirits of the murdered families began to fade back into the desert landscape, their mission of forcing acknowledgement of their deaths finally completed. Ayanna's mother lingered longest, approaching close enough for her daughter to see the love and pride in her translucent features before she too dissolved back into the wind and dust from which she had emerged. The supernatural presence that had dominated the area since the giant buffalo's appearance gradually dissipated, leaving behind only the natural sounds of desert wildlife and the distant whistle of an approaching train. Morrison collapsed completely after the spirits departed, his body racked with sobs as the full psychological impact of his confrontation with his victims finally overwhelmed his capacity to function. Ayanna looked down at the broken man who had destroyed her family and felt an unexpected surge of pity mixed with her satisfaction at seeing justice served. She gathered up her evidence and prepared to signal the hidden tribal warriors, knowing that they would need to act quickly to ensure that Morrison's confession reached the proper authorities before he recovered enough to attempt escape or suicide. The sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of territorial marshals who had been summoned by telegraph messages sent from the Apache settlement, carrying detailed accounts of Morrison's crimes along with requests for immediate investigation and arrest. Ayanna realized that her father and the tribal council had planned this timing carefully, ensuring that legal authorities would arrive just as Morrison's supernatural trial concluded and while his confession was still fresh in his traumatized mind. The marshals found Morrison babbling about ghosts and murdered Apache families, his detailed admissions providing more than enough evidence to justify immediate arrest and formal charges. As the sun set over Copper Creek for what would be the final time in Morrison's life as a free man, Ayanna watched the marshals load the broken railroad superintendent into their wagon for transport to Territorial Prison. The temporary station he had built over the graves of his victims would be torn down within days, and the land would be returned to Apache control as part of the legal settlement that would eventually emerge from his trial and conviction. The giant buffalo had not returned, but its mission had been accomplished through the combined efforts of supernatural intervention, courageous human action, and the inexorable demands of justice that could not be buried beneath any amount of concrete and steel.